The storm broke at sundown. Lightning carved the sky open like a blade, the wind screaming down from the hills with a fury that felt personal. June Callahan stumbled along the ragged edge of the old rail line, mud clawing at the hem of her dress, boots soaked through and skin raw beneath layers of cold and panic. The depot appeared out of the dusk like a ghost squat, crumbling and half swallowed by prairie grass, but it was shelter. She didn't think, she just pushed the warped door open and slipped inside. Dust hung thick in the air. The rafters creaked under the weight of wind and time. A few broken crates lined the back wall, and a rusted stove sat crooked near the corner. June dropped her satchel on the floor and slid down the wall, legs folding beneath her like paper. Her breath came fast, hard. She counted to 10, then to 20. Somewhere behind her ribs, her heart was still trying to outrun something that hadn't stopped chasing her in over a year. The rain came next hard, hammering, deafening on the tin roof. She curled into herself, arms wrapped around her knees, cheek resting against her sleeve. Her hair clung to her face, wet with sweat and rain. She tried not to remember what she'd left behind. She didn't hear the door creak open again, not right away. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed across the warped floorboards. A figure stepped through the threshold, broad-shouldered, coat-soaked, and hat dripping with rain. He didn't speak, just stood there for a moment, taking her in with eyes like slate under shadow. June tensed. Her hand drifted toward the inside of her satchel, not that there was anything in there worth defending herself with, but he didn't come closer, didn't threaten. He set something down on the floor between them, a bundle of dry socks, folded and bound with twine, and crouched near the stove. "Flues rusted through," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "But it'll catch if we're lucky." His hands moved with the kind of slow patience that spoke of repetition, of someone used to making do. In a few minutes, the faint crackle of flame grew into a steady warmth. The orange light flickered across the room, catching the side of his face. He had a rough jaw, peppered with stubble, and a scar near his left brow, half faded but unmistakable. His coat hung open, shirt clinging to a body lean and lined with years of hard labor. He didn't limp at first, not until he stood. "Take the socks," he said quietly. "You'll freeze if you don't." She didn't move, just stared at him, wide-eyed and breath held like a cornered animal. "I ain't here to ask questions," he said, settling down on the far side of the fire. "Or to answer any. Name's Reed Maddox. Just rode in to check the cattle before the storm hit." The name meant nothing to her. That felt like a relief. She reached slowly, took the socks, and peeled her wet boots off with shaking hands. Her toes were red and blistered, skin cracked. The socks were too big but warm. She didn't thank him. Not with words. He didn't expect it. The fire crackled. Rain battered the roof. Outside, the wind howled like it had lost something. Inside, they sat with silence between them, not awkward, not heavy, just quiet, safe. For the first time in a long while, June let her eyes close. Not all the way. Just enough to feel the heat on her cheeks and the ache in her bones. She didn't know who Reed Maddox really was. She didn't know what morning would bring. But tonight, she was dry. She was alive. And for now, that was enough. The storm didn't let up. It pressed harder, like it had found something worth punishing. Rain thrashed against the roof in sheets, and wind slipped through the warped boards in long, shivering gusts. The depot creaked like it might give way, but it held just enough to feel like a wall between her and everything else. Reed moved slow, like he'd done this before. His limbs carried the rhythm of someone who didn't rush unless there was a fire or a dying animal. He set a small kettle on the makeshift grate inside the crooked stove, his fingers steady even as the flames flicked back at him. June watched him from the far corner, coat still clutched tight around her. Her knees were pulled to her chest beneath the borrowed socks, and her hair hung in wet strands down the sides of her face. He didn't ask her name again, didn't ask where she'd come from or why her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. He just reached into a small canvas pouch at his belt and pulled out a tin of grounds, tapping them into the bubbling water like he had nowhere else to be. The scent of coffee crept into the room, slowly rich, bitter, grounding. It mingled with the smell of wet earth and wood smoke, wrapping around her like something familiar. June shifted slightly, loosening her grip on her coat. Reed didn't look up when he spoke. "Ain't fancy, but it's warm." She nodded once, barely. Her voice hadn't made a sound since she'd slipped inside the depot. He poured 2 small tin cups, one for himself, one for her, then set hers down on the crate between them. He didn't hand it to her. Just placed it there and leaned back, one arm resting on a bent knee. The firelight threw shadows against the far wall, their outlines soft but certain. She reached for the cup with both hands, holding it close to her chest before taking a sip. The coffee was strong and burned slightly going down, but she didn't care. It steadied her in ways the fire couldn't. Thunder cracked again, sharp, immediate, like a rifle fired from the clouds. June flinched hard, the cup sloshing, her breath caught, shoulders tensing. Reed didn't say a word. He just shifted slightly, reached for the oil lamp near the stove, and moved it closer to her side of the room. The flame inside it flickered warm and steady, throwing more light her way. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. June swallowed hard, the sting in her eyes not from smoke. They sat like that for what felt like hours, no conversation, just the low hiss of firewood and the gentle clink of metal cups as they drank in silence. The storm outside roared like it wanted to come inside. But it couldn't, not yet. She looked at him once, his profile outlined in firelight, this jaw sharp, his expression unreadable, but not cold. He caught her glance and held it just long enough to let her know he'd noticed. He didn't smile, just nodded, barely perceptible, like to say, "I see you." And that was the moment she started to believe he might mean her no harm. She didn't thank him. She didn't have the words yet, but when he poured her a second cup, and she reached for it without hesitation, that was enough. The wind howled through the cracks, but inside, smoke curled gently toward the ceiling, and the quiet between them held. Not empty, not waiting, just full of everything they weren't ready to say. By the time the sun clawed its way up over the hills, the storm had moved on, leaving behind a soaked world and a silence thick enough to feel. The depot sat in a hush broken only by the slow drip of water from the eaves and the creak of settling wood. Puddles mirrored the brightening sky, and steam lifted off the fields like the earth itself was exhaling. June hadn't left. She'd slept in the corner of the depot on a folded wool blanket Reed laid out without a word. When he rose before dawn to check the livestock, she was already awake, sitting cross-legged beside the embers of last night's fire, quietly feeding in dry kindling like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Reed didn't say anything when he returned, just handed her a biscuit wrapped in cloth and nodded toward the barn. She followed him without being asked, her boots squishing in the wet grass, the cuffs of her dress still damp. Together they hauled in what was left of the firewood from the lean-to, stacking it near the stove. She moved like someone used to working, efficient, quiet, no wasted motion. By mid-morning, she'd found a hammer and was halfway through fixing the crooked shutter on the north-facing window. Reed stood by the fence line, watching her, chewing a sprig of dry grass. The nails she used weren't the right size. The frame was warped, but she got it flush anyway, bracing it with a thin scrap of wood pulled from a broken crate. Her sleeves were rolled past her elbows, her knuckles nicked and dirt-smudged, and he saw it what most wouldn't: strength, not the loud kind, the buried kind. The kind that only shows itself when no one's watching. He turned back toward the barn when he heard the distant creak of wagon wheels over gravel. A minute later, a voice called out from the yard. "Well, if this ain't the picture of a bachelor's mess." Reed sighed before he even saw her. Mrs. Lorna Tate stepped down from her rickety wagon like she owned the land it rolled across. She was built wide and sharp, with a bonnet pulled tight over a nest of iron-gray hair and a mouth that never quite relaxed. Her eyes landed on June immediately. "And who might this be?" she asked, too sweet by half. June stiffened beside the shutter, her shoulders tensing, eyes flicking to Reed like a deer scenting blood. "She's helpin' with repairs," Reed said evenly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Helpin', is she?" Lorna sniffed, clearly unconvinced. "A woman like that don't just wander into places like this. Pretty thing like her's got a story, don't she?" June looked down. Her hands trembled once, barely noticeable unless you were looking. Reed took a step forward, blocking the line between them. "She's stayin'," he said flatly. "That's all anyone needs to know." Lorna blinked. Her lips parted, then closed again. She adjusted her shawl, muttered something about checking on the Millers, and clambered back into her wagon with more rustle than grace. The wheels turned, and soon only the ruts in the road remembered she'd been there. June hadn't moved. Reed walked over, slow and careful, and picked up the last of the nails she'd set aside. "You did good work on that shutter," he said. "Doesn't bang in the wind anymore." She nodded, chin still tucked toward her chest. He glanced at her sideways. "Folks around here don't know when to keep their mouths shut, but I do." Her eyes met his just for a breathend in that space. Something softened. She reached for the hammer again, and this time her hands were steady. The days began to fall into rhythm, soft and slow like the creak of a rocking chair or the hush of wind through dry grass. June moved through Reed's world without asking permission, and he didn't seem to mind. She washed the tin cups without being told. She swept out the depot floor when the dust got too thick. And one morning, while Reed was hauling grain sacks to the barn, she stood on a chair and mended the curtain above the stove, the one that had been torn since last winter, though he'd never thought much of it. She didn't say anything when he returned, just smoothed it down and moved on to slicing potatoes into the pot. The place began to smell like something again would smoke and sage, sometimes wild mint if she found enough sprigs along the fence line. She started boiling herbs in a dented kettle she found tucked behind a row of empty jars, said nothing about why or what they were for. Reed never asked. But the scent filled the corners of the depot and crept into the walls like it belonged there. He watched her sometimes, when she thought he wasn't. Watched how her fingers moved when she stitched a seam or rubbed lavender into the knots in her wrists. There was a stillness in her, but not peace. More like balance on a ledge, a calm that came from surviving a storm, not forgetting it. On the third morning she laughed. It wasn't loud, just a soft breath of sound when one of the chickens startled itself trying to chase a grasshopper. Reed heard it from the barn and froze mid-step. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong to the woman who had first stepped into the depot dripping wet and looking like she'd fought the whole sky. But that same afternoon, everything shifted. The air had gone quiet, the way it does before something breaks. June was hanging laundry on the line, arms lifted, hair tied back in a loose knot. Reed was up by the corral, checking the railings when he saw the rider distant, high on the ridge where the pines cut into sky. The horse was dark, the man's silhouette unfamiliar. He didn't move for a long moment, just sat, staring down at the spread below. Reed felt it before he heard it. The way the wind shifted. The way the chickens went still. June turned, saw him, and every bit of color drained from her face. The rider didn't come down. After a beat, he turned his horse and disappeared into the trees. June stood like she'd turned to stone. That night, after supper, she didn't go to the cot. Instead, she stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in Reed's old coat, arms tight across her chest. The stars were sharp above, the kind that make you feel watched. The wind tugged at her hair, and her breath came out in small clouds. Reed stood just inside the door, the lamp casting his shadow long across the wall. He didn't call to her. She didn't look back when she whispered the name. Harlan. It drifted into the night like smoke. Reed didn't say a word. He just waited at the door until she came back inside. The barn was quiet in the early light, just the low rustle of hay and the occasional snort of a horse shifting in its stall. Morning dew clung to the rafters like tears that hadn't yet fallen, and the cold crept in slow through the open slats. Reed walked in with the bucket sloshing at his side, expecting routine feed, water, checked the latch on the eastern gate. But what he found instead stopped him cold. June was there, tucked into the far corner of the loft, curled up in the hay like a child hiding from a nightmare that hadn't yet ended. Her back was to him, but her shoulders were rigid, her hands buried under her cheek, her body drawn in tight like she was holding herself together by will alone. He set the bucket down slow, the clink of metal loud in the hush. "I'll be gone before the sun's down," she said, voice small and flat. "Didn't mean to stay this long." Reed didn't move at first, just stood there, letting her words sit in the cold between them. Then he crouched slowly beside her, boots creaking under his weight, knees folding with the quiet care of a man who'd knelt beside pain before. "You're not a stray, June," he said gently. "You don't have to prove anything to stay." She turned her face, just slightly, enough for him to see the way her eyes shone, not with tears falling, but the kind of hurt that had dried midstream, the kind that had learned to hide. "I didn't mean to bring trouble," she whispered. "He saw me. I know he did. If he comes back." Reed didn't flinch. "If he comes back, he'll find he's not the only one watching." She shook her head, but the fight in her was slipping, undone by something quieter than force. Her breath hitched, and her shoulders started to tremble, not the hard kind, not the wailing grief she'd probably buried long ago. Just a soft, unraveling kind, like a rope fraying one thread at a time. Reed reached into the nearby tack trunk and pulled out the wool blanket he kept for cold nights. It still smelled faintly of cedar. He draped it gently over her shoulders, tucking it around her like you would a wounded animal, carefully, respectfully, without noise. "You're safe now," he said, low and steady. June closed her eyes, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. A chicken clucked outside. One of the horses huffed softly behind them. The world kept turning, slow and indifferent. But here, in this small corner of the barn, time felt like it had bent in reverence to their stillness. Reed didn't ask again if she wanted to leave. And June, for the first time since stepping off that storm-choked road, didn't say that she would. The morning sky was streaked with pale gray, clouds dragging low and slow like they were tired of moving. The north fence had taken a beating during the storm, 3 posts down, one snapped clean through. Reed had mentioned it the night before with a quiet sigh and a glance at the barn tools, and June had nodded without hesitation. No one had to ask for help anymore. That part had settled in. The ground was still soft underfoot, thick with mud that sucked at boots and clung to hems. Reed carried the replacement posts over one shoulder, his limp more noticeable on uneven ground. June followed behind with a coil of rope and a rust-streaked spade, hair tied back, cheeks pink from the cold air. They worked in silence, but not the strained kind, just the kind shaped by rhythm. Familiar now. Reed set the new post into the hole he'd already half dug, squinting at the angle. "Little more left," June said, one hand braced against the wood to hold it upright. "Know you're left." He smirked, adjusted the post. "Always bossing me around." She arched a brow. Somebody has to keep things straight. He chuckled low, deep in his chest, and drove the spade into the ground. The dirt gave way with a wet squelch. He leaned into it, shoulder taut beneath his worn shirt, sweat beading at his temple despite the chill. June kept the post steady, hands wrapped tight around the slick wood. A gust of wind whipped up, pushing her coat open and flinging loose strands of hair into her eyes. She blinked, just as her boot slid in the mud. She slipped with a sharp gasp. In a blink, Reed's hand shot out, catching her at the waist. His grip was strong, warm, sure. She froze, one hand still clinging to the post, the other braced against his chest. He held her steady, his fingers splayed over the curve of her hip, thumb resting just beneath the edge of her belt. The air between them shifted, no longer cold, just charged. Her breath caught in her throat. His eyes were on hers, storm-colored and steady, but softer than she'd ever seen them. He didn't let go right away. She didn't step back. When he finally did release her, it was slow, his hand lingering just a second longer than it had to. She smoothed her coat, cheeks flushed, and looked away. But she didn't move farther than a pace. They finished the fence before sundown. Neither said a word about the slip, or the touch. That night, the fire cracked low in the stove, casting flickers of gold across the walls. Reed sat in his usual chair, boots off, legs stretched out. June curled on the floor nearby with a blanket around her shoulders, mending a worn cuff with small, precise stitches. She didn't glance at him, not directly, but she shifted closer, just a few inches. Close enough that her knee brushed his. He didn't move. Neither did she. Outside, the wind moved through the grass like a whisper. Inside, they sat with shoulders not quite touching, heat humming between them, silence curling like smoke. Neither of them reached for more. But neither of them pulled away. The wind had a bite that morning, dry and sharp as Reed rode back from the feed store with a sack of oats slung over his saddle. The sky was clear, but too quiet, the kind of silence that made a man's bones uneasy. As the depot came into view, something curled cold in his gut. The yard was still, no kettle on the porch, no clothes flapping on the line, no sign of her. He called once. "June?" No answer. He dismounted in 2 strides, boots striking the porch hard. The door stood slightly ajar. Inside, everything looked untouched, blanket folded, cup by the stove. Her coat was gone. Her satchel, too. No note. No trail of words, just absence, thick and sudden. His breath went hard, tight. He walked the perimeter once, eyes scanning the dirt. Then he found them hoofprints in the soft edge of the pasture heading west. A second set. Smaller. June. He didn't bother packing a lunch or refilling his canteen. Just grabbed his rifle, swung up into the saddle, and rode like the ground was burning behind him. Rage coiled beneath his calm, sharp and steady. Not the loud kind, the kind that built in the space where fear lived. He followed the trail out past the creek, where the trees knotted dense and the canyon road forked off toward the hills. That's where the tracks veered, half lost in the dust. He didn't need to guess. There was only one man who knew how to haunt a woman with silence this deep. Harlan Kane. He found them near the rock outcrop just before the canyon pass. June stood alone, arms crossed tightly, hair whipped by the wind. Harlan sat atop a dark gelding, long coat billowing, hat tipped low. Reed slowed his horse but didn't stop. June's back was straight, but Reed could see the tension in her shoulders. Her voice was low but firm. "I told you I'm not going with you." "You were mine," Harlan said, smiling that thin, dead-eyed smile. "Ain't nothing changed that." Reed dismounted without a word. Harlan turned his head just enough. "This your new man? The one feeding you scraps and letting you sew curtains like some wifed-up ghost?" Reed didn't answer, didn't have to. He stepped between them, one hand resting near the butt of his rifle. "You've had your say," he said, voice like gravel. "Now you ride out." Harlan's smile twitched. "That a threat?" "It's a promise." A long silence stretched between them, the kind only 2 men who've bled before could understand. Then Harlan clicked his tongue and turned the gelding with a slow pull of the reins. "Wasn't worth the ride anyhow," he muttered. "She's already gone, and she don't even know it." June didn't move, didn't speak. Reed watched him disappear into the dust, waited until even the hoofbeats had faded. Then he turned to her. She was still standing stiff, jaw clenched so tight it trembled. He didn't ask why she left, didn't scold, didn't demand. He just lifted her onto his horse, swung up behind her, and wrapped one steady arm around her waist. They didn't speak a single word on the ride home. They didn't need to. The fire in the depot had burned down low, casting long, flickering shadows across the floorboards. The light barely reached the corners now, where dust clung to the baseboards and everything felt colder than it should. Reed stood by the stove, one hand on the kettle that hadn't boiled yet, the other clenched around the back of a chair he wasn't sitting in. His jaw worked, slow and tight, like there were words he wanted to say but couldn't trust to come out clean. June stood just inside the door, her coat still on, hair windblown and wild. Her face was pale, and her fingers twisted around themselves like she was trying to wring out the guilt before speaking. "I wasn't trying to run," she said softly. Reed didn't look at her. "I needed to see him. I thought if I said the words out loud he'd let go, that maybe I could stop hearing him every time I closed my eyes." Still, he didn't speak. "I was wrong," she said, voice thinner now, "and I'm sorry." He let the silence stretch, not to punish her, but because it was the only thing holding back the flood in his chest. When he finally turned, his eyes weren't angry, they were tired, raw, worn through with fear he hadn't let himself name until now. He stepped toward her. "You don't owe me anything, June, not apologies, not explanations." Her breath hitched. "I just need to know," he said, his voice low, trembling with something deeper than rage, "if you leave again." He stopped, took another step, and gently placed a hand at her waist. "I'm coming with you." June's eyes shone in the firelight, wide and wet, and full of something between disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. She reached up slowly, not with urgency, but with aching care, and let her forehead rest against his. Their breath mingled in that space between them, warm and quiet. "I don't want to leave anymore," she whispered. "Not this, not you." He didn't pull her closer, not yet. He just let his hand stay where it was solid, real, grounding her like the floor under her boots. His other hand lifted, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes fluttered closed. His stayed open, watching her like she might disappear again if he blinked too long. The fire popped once in the stove, and outside the wind picked up, rattling the glass with a shiver of old echoes. But inside, nothing moved except the space between them growing smaller. Not with urgency, with certainty. He didn't kiss her. She didn't ask him to. He just held her there, in the quiet warmth, like maybe the worst had passed. Like maybe this wasn't just shelter anymore. It was something worth staying for. The days began to string themselves together like beads on a wire, quiet, unhurried, but firm. The kind of days that didn't ask anything of you but presence. June stayed. She didn't say the words outright, but she moved through the space like someone who had stopped waiting for permission. The cot in the corner stayed folded, untouched. Her coat now hung by the stove, and her satchel had been placed neatly beneath the shelf with the spare linens, as if it had always belonged there. She started painting the windowsills one morning with a chipped brush and a half-empty can of whitewash Reed didn't remember owning. She tied a rag around her hair and worked in quiet concentration, lips pressed and eyes steady. When Reed asked what she was doing, she didn't pause. "They peel if you let them," she said, brushing over a flake. "Better to catch it early." Later that week, he found his coat slung over the back of the chair, a new lining stitched into the inside. It was soft and sturdy, warmer than it had ever been. He didn't ask how she'd managed it, just ran a hand over the seam and nodded once, holding the gesture like a prayer. She added little things here and there, a bundle of dried herbs above the hearth, a tin cup turned into a planter on the sill, and one morning, Reed hammered a new hook into the wall beside the door. When she asked what it was for, he pointed with a calloused thumb. "Your hat's been hanging on the chair too long." She looked at him, brow arched just slightly, but the corners of her mouth curved. "Well then," she said, and hung it up. They rebuilt the smokehouse in early spring, tearing out the rotted boards and replacing them plank by plank. She measured while he sawed. He nailed while she braced the frame with her shoulder. Their conversation was sparse, Mostly nods and the occasional, hand me that, or, hold it steady. But something lived in that silence now, comfort, not caution. One afternoon, while Reed was fixing a squeaky hinge on the barn door, Mrs. Lorna Tate rode up again. She brought a basket of preserves and the same nose for gossip she always carried. Reed saw her eyes flick to June, who was kneeling by the herb bed, pressing new soil around the roots of a small rosemary bush. "Well now," Lorna drawled, "seems she's made herself right at home." June stood, brushed her hands on her skirt, and turned toward her. No flinch, no hesitation. "My name's June Callahan," she said. "And yes, I live here." Lorna blinked once, lips parting just slightly. Reed didn't speak. He just watched June, a slow warmth spreading in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. She said it again a few days later, at the mercantile in town, when a store hand asked if she was Mr. Maddox's guest. "No," she said, bag of flour balanced on one hip. "I'm his partner." Reed caught the look on the boy's face. But what he remembered more was the way June's chin lifted as she said it, like she was claiming something she'd already earned. And this time, no one questioned it. The seasons shifted without announcement, as they always did, first in the smell of rain on warming dirt, then in the slow unfurling of green along the hills. The fields that had once laid brittle and gray under frost now shimmered with life, tufts of grass reaching toward the sun like they'd never known cold. The creek ran louder with meltwater. Birds nested in the rafters again. The wind that used to howl like it was chasing something had grown quiet, softer in its passing, like it had settled too. Reed and June spent the morning stringing new wire along the western pasture, the kind of task that didn't require many words, just rhythm. By midday, with sweat at their backs and dirt on their palms, they retired to the patch of shade behind the barn, beneath the wide arms of the old sycamore tree. It had been there longer than either of them, roots twisted deep into the soil, branches spread like open hands above. Reed leaned back against the trunk, legs stretched out, his arms slung lazily around June's shoulders. She sat beside him with her knees tucked to her chest, boots kicked off, toes buried in the cool grass. The breeze played with the ends of her hair, lifting them gently before letting them fall again. Overhead, a hawk circled in slow, deliberate arcs against the pale blue sky. Neither of them spoke for a long while. They didn't need to. June traced circles in the dirt beside her with one finger, the motion idle, thoughtful. Then, quietly, she said, "I used to think survival was the best I could do." Reed turned his head to look at her, eyes shaded by the brim of his hat. His smile came easy, slow, and warm. "This ain't survival anymore." Her breath caught a little, but not from pain. Just from the weight of truth landing gently in her chest. She looked at him fully now, her gaze clear. "No, it's not." She leaned into him, her head resting against the place where his chest rose and fell, slow and steady. His hand curled a little tighter around her shoulder, not possessive, just sure. The sun filtered through the sycamore leaves above, dappling the grass in gold. June closed her eyes and listened, not for footsteps, not for distant threats, not for the ghosts that had once chased her through sleepless nights. Just for this: the rustle of wind through branches, the soft creak of barnwood nearby, and the steady beat of Reed's heart beneath her ear. They stayed like that as the afternoon slipped past them, unnoticed. There had been a time when June measured her life an escape show, fast she could run, how far she could disappear. But now she measured it in quieter things: the weight of a hand at her back, the warmth of shared silence, the color of the hills when spring returned. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was home, and it wasn't the end of her story, it was the place where everything else could finally begin.